Hi, I'm Nick, and in this video we'll be talking about sex and its relation to yeast infections. Yes, it is true. A yeast infection can be spread during sexual activity. Although the chance is somewhat small, it still can happen. Typically, if you're sexually active with a partner who has a genital yeast infection, you have about a 10% chance of acquiring the yeast infection yourself, and it could possibly be even higher than a 10% chance. And according to the United States Center for Disease Control, Candida infections of the genitals can help STDs, or sexually transmitted diseases, spread much more easier. So if you do have a yeast infection, you have that much more chance of picking up an STD when you have sex. Interestingly enough, one study entitled "The Weapon Potential of a Microbe" analyzed how well Candida yeast could be used as a biological weapon. It is quite an interesting study and does show that Candida can be so contagious that it could be classified to some extent as a biological weapon. The study was published in 2004 in the journal Trends in Microbiology. The study used a few different characteristics of different microbes to determine just how well they could be used as a biological weapon. One of the factors of a microbe's weapon potential considered by the study was an organism's virulence, which was determined by looking at the amount of people who would develop symptoms versus those who would not develop symptoms, given a specific amount of a pathogen injected into their bodies. How stable an organism was another factor. How contagious or communicable a pathogen was another factor. And the amount of time an organism would require to cause an infection was a final factor. The study found that Candida did have some weapons potential, actually. Although it was low, it was still there. So we can be assured that Candida yeast is contagious and can spread during physical contact. A 2009 study published in the African Journal of Microbiology Research also found that Candida was in fact contagious and could be spread during sex. In fact, the study states that as far as genital yeast infections are concerned, sexual activity is the most common way these infections are spread between people. Well, concerning a male sex partner, do you need to treat them for a yeast infection if they don't show any symptoms? Because Candida is a small yeast and can live on the penis and in the semen of males. Several studies have shown that asymptomatic men who do have yeast in their semen or on their penis do not cause yeast infections in their female partners. So no, treating an asymptomatic male for Candida is not required to prevent a yeast infection from happening again in a female sexual partner. So what about different sex acts? Does merely having sex cause you to be more likely to get a yeast infection? The answer to that is no. Sexual intercourse does not predispose you or increase your risk for developing a vaginal yeast infection. But as far as women go, if a woman frequently receives receptive oral sex, she is much more likely to get a yeast infection than a woman who does not receive oral sex. In fact, she's around 2 times as likely to develop a vaginal yeast infection because of this sex act. And also, women who masturbate with saliva also have an increased risk of developing a vaginal yeast infection. A 2003 study published in the Journal of Women's Health found that women who received oral sex had over a 2 times greater chance for developing a yeast infection compared with those women who did not receive as much oral sex. And as far as women who masturbated with saliva, they had around a 3 times greater chance of developing a vaginal yeast infection. So it would seem that we could perhaps conclude by the research that sexual acts that put saliva in direct contact with the genitals especially for women, do tend to increase their risk of developing a yeast infection. So in conclusion, yes, sex can spread a yeast infection. And although it's not so likely, you have perhaps around a 10% chance of getting a yeast infection from an infected sex partner if you routinely engage in sex with them while they have a yeast infection. So to be safe, you probably want to get that Candida problem cleared up before you start touching an infected area too much, especially during sex. Well, for more information on this topic, we have a whole article about it on Candida Hub. There's a lot of information there, and if you'd like, you can check it out. The link is just below in the description. And while you're there, you can find out about an all-natural 12-hour solution for yeast infections that can totally eliminate them in about half a day and allow you to get back into your sex life without any more hassle from a Candida problem. Okay, hey, thanks so much for watching. See ya.